In a quiet museum case on the island of Crete sits a small disc of baked clay, covered edge to edge in symbols stamped into the wet clay before it was ever fired. In more than a century since it first surfaced, not one single scholar has ever read a single word it actually says. 45 different signs, repeated 241 times, spiral inward from the rim toward the center on both of its faces, in a script that has never once been matched to anything else found anywhere on Earth. By the end of this, you will know exactly why a single small object has defeated every attempt to read it for over 100 years, and why some researchers have started asking an even stranger question about it entirely. The story begins on the 3rd of July, 1908, on the south coast of Crete, at the ruins of a vast Bronze Age palace complex called Phaistos. An Italian archaeologist named Luigi Pernia was excavating a small underground storage chamber, likely once used to hold temple records, when his workers uncovered something unlike anything found before at the site. Lying in the debris beside a tablet inscribed in the script now called Linear A was this strange, near-perfect disc, fired hard all the way through, its surface crowded edge to edge with tiny stamped pictures arranged in tight spiraling rows. Pernia recognized at once that this was no ordinary find. The tablet beside it at least matched writing already known from other minoan sites. The disc matched absolutely nothing anyone had ever seen. Word of the discovery spread through the archaeological world within months, and the arguments over what this small object actually was have never really stopped since. To understand why it caused such a stir, you have to look closely at the object itself. The disc is small, barely larger than the palm of a hand, some 16 centimeters across. Both faces are covered in symbols, but they were not carved freehand the way every other Bronze Age tablet from this region was made. This disc was made completely differently. Someone pressed each individual sign into the still soft clay using a small carved stamp, lifted it away, then pressed again, symbol after symbol, all the way around the disc in careful spiraling rows. That detail alone should stop you. Stamping instead of carving means someone had already carved 45 separate miniature stamps, one for every unique sign, before a single word was ever pressed into this clay. In other words, whoever made this had already invented something remarkably close to movable type, more than 3,000 years before printing was ever developed anywhere in Europe. Look closer, and the symbols are not scattered at random either. They spiral inward from the outer rim toward the center, on both faces, in one continuous unbroken curving line. Straight lines cut across that spiral at regular intervals, dividing the symbols into small clusters, exactly the way a slash or a gap breaks a sentence into separate words. Count every stamped impression on both faces and you arrive at 241 symbols total, built from just 45 unique signs, used again and again in different combinations. Some of those 45 signs are wonderfully specific. A marching man wearing a tall plumed helmet, a round shield, a flowering plant, a wide-toothed comb, and what looks unmistakably like a fish. Whoever designed this system was clearly not scribbling at random. They were following a real, consistent set of rules, precise enough that scholars still argue today over exactly what kind of message it is. Look even closer at individual signs and the craftsmanship becomes almost unsettling. The plumed helmet figure has visible muscle lines in the legs, each stamped from the same tiny mold with startling consistency. The fish sign shows individual scales. The flowering plant shows separate petals and a curling stem. These were not crude stamps. They were tiny, deliberate works of miniature sculpture. A few signs appear to carry small marks above them, tiny strokes some researchers read as accent-like additions, perhaps changing the sound or meaning of the sign beneath, the way a modern letter can carry an accent mark. Whatever those small marks mean, their presence tells us something important. This was not decoration repeated for beauty. This behaves like a real writing system, with its own internal grammar of marks and modifiers. And that single fact, that this looks unmistakably like language and not ornament, is exactly what has kept researchers obsessed with this small disc for more than 100 years. So why, after more than a full century of serious scholarly effort, has nobody actually translated it? The honest answer starts with a brutal fact of cryptography. Every code ever broken in recorded history has been broken because there was enough text to work with, and usually something familiar to compare it against. This disk gives researchers neither advantage. 241 symbols is a tiny sample, roughly the length of a single short paragraph, nowhere near enough to map an unknown language by statistics alone. Worse still, there is no bilingual key anywhere, no equivalent of a Rosetta Stone, pairing these exact symbols with any language that anyone living today already understands. And the deepest problem of all is this. Not one of these 45 signs, not a single one, has ever turned up on any other object anywhere in the many decades since this disc was found. Crete in this same period already had its own well-established writing systems in daily use. Linear A recorded temple business and trade across the island, and its descendant, Linear B, was eventually deciphered decades later. Linear B was finally cracked in the 1950s, and only because scholars had hundreds of surviving tablets, repeated formulas, and eventually a decisive guess that it recorded an early form of Greek. None of those advantages exist here. The Phaistos Disc stamped symbols share almost nothing with Linear A or Linear B, not their shapes, not their structure, not even the basic method used to put them onto the clay. As far as anyone can determine, this is a script built once, used exactly once, and never used again, at least not on anything that has survived the more than 3,000 years since. That isolation is precisely what makes the disc so maddening to study. It behaves exactly like a genuine written message, delivered inside a locked room with no matching key left anywhere else on the planet. None of that has stopped people from trying anyway. For more than a century, decoding the Phaistos Disc has been something of an obsession sport among linguists, historians, and enthusiastic amateurs alike. Dozens of full so-called translations have been published over the decades. One researcher read the disc as a hymn addressed to a minoan goddess. Another insisted it was a solar calendar tracking the turning seasons. A different proposal claimed the disc listed conscripted soldiers by town and unit. Yet another read it as a peace treaty between rival cities, or even as the rules to some forgotten ancient board game. In the early 2000s, one prominent linguist even proposed a detailed sound-by-sound reading, arguing the disc records a specific prayer in an early Aegean language, syllable by syllable. Each new decoding arrives with total, confident certainty, and each one, so far without exception, has been quietly rejected by the wider community of Aegean scholars, usually within just a few years of publication. The problem is not a lack of imagination. With only 241 symbols and nothing genuine to compare them against, almost any confident reading can be made to fit the pattern, and none can ever truly be proven. It is, in the end, the linguistic equivalent of finding a locked door with no visible keyhole at all, and 100 confident voices each insisting they already know exactly what waits behind it. And there is a question almost nobody outside this small field of study ever hears about at all. A small but genuinely persistent group of researchers has spent decades asking something far more uncomfortable than what the disc symbols actually mean. They have asked whether it is genuinely ancient at all. Their suspicion centers heavily on Pernia himself. No second example of this exact stamping technique, or these exact 45 symbols, has ever been unearthed before or since, anywhere on Crete or beyond it. One outspoken art historian argued openly in the 2000s that Pernia's own excavation notes were, by the standards even of his own time, unusually thin, and that a fraud could not be entirely ruled out. Critics of the disc's authenticity point out that in more than 100 years of intensive digging across the wider Aegean world, not one comparable stamped clay object has ever surfaced again. The suspicion has never once been proven, and the overwhelming majority of mainstream archaeologists firmly reject it. Laboratory analysis of the clay itself and its firing pattern both support a genuine Bronze Age origin. But the simple fact that this question can still be seriously raised, more than 100 years after the discovery, tells you exactly how strange and how isolated this one small object truly is. Modern science has at least settled the material question. Laboratory analysis of the clay is fully consistent with local Cretan sources, and the firing method matches other confirmed Bronze Age Minoan pottery techniques. Most archaeologists now date the disc to somewhere around 1700 years before Christ, the very same general era as the Linear A tablet that was found lying right beside it in that same small storage chamber. That places its creation firmly within Minoan Crete's most sophisticated period, a civilization already trading across the wider Mediterranean, already raising multi-story palaces, already keeping detailed written records of grain, oil, and tribute. Which only deepens the real puzzle here. A culture this advanced, this well-connected, apparently invented a stamped writing method remarkable enough to prefigure the printing press, and then, as far as anyone can tell, simply never used it again. So if it is not a hoax, and it has not been decoded, then what, honestly, is this small object? Modern scholarship has converged, cautiously, on a short list of genuine possibilities. The stamped symbols and the spiral format most closely resemble the structure of a hymn, a prayer, or a ritual chant, with repeated phrases marked off the way a refrain is marked in a song. The recurring images, a marching soldier, a bound captive, a plumed helmet, also fit neatly with a commemorative or dedicatory text, the kind that might once have accompanied an offering left at a temple. Some researchers focus instead on the small vertical dividing lines, noting that they break the spiral into groups exactly the length of ordinary words in other known ancient languages of the region. That single detail matters more than it first appears. It strongly suggests this disc is not decoration, and not some elaborate puzzle, but genuine language, structured the exact way real written sentences are structured. Which brings us back to the real answer this video promised you at the very beginning. The truth is not a dramatic reveal of what the disc actually says. The truth is why, even with everything modern scholarship can bring to bear on it, it almost certainly never will be fully read. Every ancient script ever successfully deciphered in history has shared one crucial thing this disc simply does not have. More than one surviving example. Egyptian hieroglyphs, for instance, had the Rosetta Stone as a bilingual key, letting scholars line up a known language against an unknown one. Linear B had hundreds of surviving tablets to compare across many different sites, and eventually one decisive, lucky guess about which known language it actually recorded, letting scholars finally crack it open after decades of failed attempts. The Phaistos Disc has exactly one surviving object, one hand's worth of stamped symbols, and nothing else remotely like it anywhere else on the entire planet, before it was made or since. That is not a temporary gap waiting patiently to be filled in by the next lucky excavation season. Cryptographers broadly agree that 241 symbols from one lone source may simply never be enough. No matter how many more decades of careful study pass, no matter how many brilliant minds take up the challenge next, the raw statistical odds of ever cracking this specific code remain genuinely bleak. The most honest answer modern scholarship can actually give is this. The Phaistos Disc is very likely a genuine, isolated fragment of a real Bronze Age writing system, a religious or ceremonial text. It was stamped into being by a method invented thousands of years ahead of its time, by people whose names we will never know, for a purpose we will very likely never fully recover. And it may be permanently unreadable, not because we lack the imagination or the tools to crack it, but because history left us only a single copy of a language that was never meant to stand entirely alone. The 45 small pictures spiraling endlessly across its surface were never silent by design. They went silent only because time slowly erased everyone else who could once actually read them. In recent years, museum conservators have scanned every single stamped impression on the disc in exhaustive three-dimensional detail, hoping careful computer analysis might finally spot a subtle pattern the human eye had simply missed for over a century of close study. So far, even the machines have found nothing decisive enough to settle the argument. And still, every few years, a new graduate student or a newly retired professor announces confidently that they have finally cracked it at last. Not one of those fresh, confident claims has yet survived serious scrutiny from the wider field of Aegean studies, which is, in its own strange way, exactly why this one small object has never once stopped fascinating people for well over 100 years. Today the Phaistos Disc rests quietly behind reinforced glass in the Heraklion Archaeological Museum on Crete, one of the single most visited objects in the entire building, still spiraling patiently toward a center that nobody, in well over 100 years, has ever truly reached.